The snow came down in slow, heavy curtains, draping the world in a hush so thick even the whistle of the arriving train sounded muted, distant, like a memory. The iron beast hissed and groaned against the cold as it pulled into the desolate station, its windows fogged, its passengers bundled and weary. In the last car, beneath a battered carpetbag and trembling hands, sat Pearl Hart, a slip of a girl dressed in white lace, out of place in this gray and brutal world. She rose when the train shuddered to a stop, gathering her courage the way a soldier might gather his sword, and stepped down onto the platform. The instant her boots touched the wood, a fierce gust of wind snatched at her veil, pulling it like a ghost toward the endless pale fields beyond. She clutched it to her chest, glancing about the empty station with wide, searching eyes. There were only a few souls braving the storm. Ranchers in thick coats, mothers pulling their children along, a couple of hired men shoving crates. But none who seemed to be looking for her. None who wore the face she had memorized from the photograph mailed months ago with trembling, hopeful words. The cross at her neck glinted dully, a stark line against the fine lace of her bodice. She touched it, grounding herself, remembering Mama's hand pressing it into hers the night before she left, whispering prayers meant to follow her across every mile of this rough country. Snow gathered at her hem and tangled in her hair as she turned, searching again, her heart beating a frantic rhythm. At last, from the far side of the platform, a tall man in a dusty hat pushed through the swirling snow. He moved with purpose, boots striking the boards hard enough to sound over the storm. Martin Kane. The name that had filled pages of letters and dreams. The man who promised steady land, a warm house, a chance at something like a life. He stopped a few feet from her, eyes raking over her figure with a scowl. His face was handsome in the way of carved stone, sharp, cold, unyielding. Pearl Hart offered a small, nervous smile, reaching into her cloak to retrieve the final letter he had sent, the one that promised he would know her by the silver cross she wore. But Martin's gaze had already caught on it. The cross. His mouth twisted. He didn't reach for the letter. Didn't offer a greeting. "You one of them Bible women?" he said, voice cutting the air sharper than the wind. Pearl Hart's fingers tightened on the letter. She swallowed hard, willing herself steady. "Only my mama's faith, sir. She asked me to keep it close." Martin snorted, a sound of contempt more than humor. He looked her up and down again, finding fault in the dirt clinging to the hem of her dress, the raw pink of her cheeks, the thinness of her arms. "I ain't looking to be preached at in my own home," he said, pulling his coat tighter around him. "Nor to have a wife who spends more time on her knees praying than tending to what needs doing." Pearl Hart's heart cracked then, a hairline fracture, invisible but deep. She opened her mouth, searching for words, but found none. Martin tipped his hat back just enough to show her the finality in his eyes. "Find yourself another fool," he said. "Ain't no place for piety on my land." Without waiting for a reply, he turned and strode back the way he had come, disappearing into the snow as if he had never been there at all. For a long moment, Pearl Hart stood frozen, the rejected letter wilting in her hand, the cold sinking teeth into her bones. Around her, life moved on. The stationmaster's lantern swung on its hook. The hired men cursed as they wrangled crates. The train huffed and prepared to leave again, carrying away the last familiar piece of her old life. She was alone. Utterly and without recourse. A small, stooped man in a thick scarf approached her then, his face crinkled with sympathy. "Miss," he said, voice rough with years and winter. "You're welcome to sit a spell in the office. There's a stove. I can't offer much, but better than standing here freezing your soul out." Pearl Hart nodded numbly, letting him guide her toward a narrow door tucked into the station wall. Inside, the world was a little warmer, the small cast-iron stove popping and hissing as it battled the cold seeping in through every crack. She sank onto a wooden bench, pulling her carpet-bag close, feeling the sting of rejection settle into her marrow. Tears threatened but did not fall. She wouldn't give the storm the satisfaction. The old station master bustled about, tending the fire and muttering to himself. He left a mug of weak coffee on a nearby crate, a small kindness Pearl Hart couldn't yet bring herself to accept. Outside, the snow thickened, blurring the outlines of the world. She watched it swirl and dance through the grimy window pane, feeling herself growing smaller with every passing minute, shrinking into a thing forgotten by time and mercy. Somewhere in the distance, a telegraph tapped out a lonely, stuttering message, its meaning lost beneath the storm's howling chorus. The door creaked open again, letting in a fresh gust of bitter air. Pearl Hart didn't turn immediately. She didn't want to see another set of indifferent eyes passing judgment on her. But something about the presence lingering at the threshold pulled at her, gentle and persistent as a memory of summer. She glanced over her shoulder. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy oilskin coat dusted with snow. His hat was pulled low, his face shadowed, but his posture spoke of a different kind of strength, one not sharpened into cruelty by the world, but hardened into something patient and unyielding. He spoke briefly with the station master, his voice low and steady, the words inaudible to Pearl Hart over the crackling of the stove. Then his gaze turned to her. Not to her dress, not to her cross, not to the pitiful carpetbag at her feet. To her, the woman beneath it all. For a long moment they simply looked at one another across the dim room, the storm raging outside and something quieter, deeper stirring between them. The man gave a small nod, a gesture that somehow asked permission rather than demanded anything. Pearl Hart, trembling though she was, found herself lifting her chin a fraction, granting it. He crossed the room in slow, sure steps, kneeling beside her bench so they were eye level. Up close, his face was lined and rough, the beard shadowing his jaw speckled with gray. His eyes were the color of the river stones Pearl Hart used to skip as a child, deep, enduring, ancient. He didn't offer a name. Didn't ask for hers. Didn't reach out as Martin had to seize and measure. Instead, he said softly, in a voice like worn leather and campfire smoke, "You got anywhere to go, miss?" Pearl Hart shook her head, the motion small, almost invisible. The man nodded again as if he had expected nothing different. "My place is not far," he said, gaze steady. "Warm. Safe. If you've got nowhere else." He didn't smile. Didn't promise. Only offered. Pearl Hart looked down at her hands, raw and red from the cold, the silver cross catching a stray beam of lamplight. Was it foolish to trust a stranger? Perhaps. But it seemed far more foolish to sit here waiting for salvation that had already turned its back on her. She rose slowly, gathering her bag in her tattered pride. The man stood as well, offering his arm in the old-fashioned way, crook bent and hand steady. Pearl Hart hesitated, then slid her hand into the crook of his elbow. Outside, the snow roared against the earth, but within the small circle of warmth they carried between them, Pearl Hart felt, for the first time in what felt like years, that maybe she was not meant to weather this storm alone. They stepped into the blizzard together, the station fading into a blur behind them, the path ahead vanishing into white unknown. Pearl Hart did not know where this road would lead. Only that, for now, she would walk it. And that, for the first time in too long, was enough. The wind tore at them like angry hands as they stepped away from the dim safety of the station. But the man's presence beside Pearl Hart was a steadying weight against the fury of the storm. His horse stood tethered nearby, a big chestnut with a white blaze down its nose, steam curling from its nostrils as it stamped impatiently at the frozen ground. He said little as he helped Pearl Hart onto the saddle, lifting her with surprising gentleness, as if he feared she might shatter beneath his touch. Then he swung up behind her, the horse shifting under their combined weight, and wrapped one strong arm around her waist to steady her. The warmth of him, the simple living warmth of another soul, seeped through the layers of her coat and dress, thawing something inside her that had been locked in ice. They moved out into the white wasteland, the snow swallowing the world until it felt like they floated between heaven and earth, alone in a place without borders or time. The man kept the horse at a careful, steady pace, his other hand loose but sure on the reins. Now and then he leaned closer, his breath stirring the hair at Pearl Hart's temple, to murmur directions to the animal, low and calm. Time stretched and folded in the storm. Pearl Hart's fingers grew numb where they clutched the saddle horn. Her eyelids grew heavy, weighed down by cold and exhaustion. She might have slipped into sleep, might have fallen entirely into the storm's mercy, if not for the occasional squeeze of the man's hand against her side, anchoring her to the present. At last, after what felt like a lifetime adrift, a dark shape emerged from the endless white. A squat cabin, its roof bowed under a heavy burden of snow, smoke limping from a bent stovepipe. The man brought the horse to a halt before the small porch and dismounted in one fluid motion. He turned, lifting Pearl Hart down with the same quiet care he had shown before, setting her lightly on the frozen ground. Her knees wobbled, and for a moment she leaned into him, the roughness of his coat scraping her cheek, the steady thud of his heart a drumbeat of survival. Without a word, he guided her up the 3 creaking steps and pushed open the door. Warmth hit her like a wave. Real, living heat, radiating from a cast-iron stove in the center of the single-room cabin. The walls were lined with rough-hewn shelves, books jammed in every available space, tins of coffee and beans stacked neatly beside a worn, scarred table. The man removed his coat and shook the snow from it, hanging it by the door before turning back to her. His hair was damp and curling slightly at the ends, his beard dusted with melted snowflakes. He didn't smile, but there was a softness to his expression, a kind of patient expectation. Pearl Hart stood trembling in the entryway, unsure what to do, unsure what was expected. In her old life, she would have been expected to wait for instructions, to shrink herself small enough to fit into whatever mold was offered. Instead, she moved forward on her own, peeling off her sodden gloves, removing her cloak, revealing the simple white dress beneath. The man's eyes flickered briefly to the cross at her throat, but there was no judgment there. Only recognition. As if he had seen such burdens before and understood the weight they carried. He gestured to a chair near the stove, and Pearl Hart sank into it gratefully, stretching her frozen fingers toward the blessed heat. "I'll see to the horse," he said, voice still that low, steady rumble that seemed more a part of the storm than separate from it. Pearl Hart watched him through the frosted window as he moved with methodical efficiency, unsaddling the horse, leading it to a small lean-to stable half hidden by snowdrifts. He brushed the animal down, spoke to it in soft tones, treated it like a companion rather than a tool. When he returned, stomping snow from his boots, Pearl Hart had thought enough to notice her surroundings more fully. A battered Bible sat on the table, its cover worn thin by use. A rifle rested in the corner, polished but unthreatening. Above the stove, a string of drying herbs lent the air a faint, earthy fragrance. The man set about making coffee, his movements sure and practiced. He filled a tin pot with water from a barrel near the door, measured out grounds with a wooden scoop, set the pot on the stove to boil. The simple rhythmic task seemed to ground the cabin, to knit the frayed edges of the world back together. Pearl Hart watched him, her mind turning over the strangeness of it all. She should have been terrified. She was alone with a stranger, miles from anyone who might hear a scream. But instead of fear, she felt an odd, cautious peace. As if she had stumbled not into danger, but into the eye of a storm. He poured 2 tin mugs of coffee and brought one to her, setting it carefully on the table within easy reach. Then he pulled up another chair and sat across from her, cradling his own mug between calloused hands. For a while they simply sat, the only sounds the pop of the fire and the whisper of the storm outside. At last he spoke. "Name's Eli Ramsey," he said, voice rough but kind. Pearl Hart's own name caught in her throat, but she managed to find it. "Pearl Hart," she whispered. Eli nodded, as if the exchange of names was all that needed to be said. As if names themselves were a kind of vow, binding them to a shared understanding. He didn't ask what had brought her here, or why she wore a wedding dress under her heavy cloak. He didn't pry. He simply accepted her presence, the way the cabin accepted the snow piling against its walls. The coffee was bitter but hot, and Pearl Hart drank it gratefully, feeling life creep back into her frozen limbs. Eli rose again after a time, setting a battered pot of beans on the stove. He moved with a quiet grace, every action purposeful, unhurried. Pearl Hart offered to help, but he shook his head, his eyes warm and firm. "Rest," he said simply. She obeyed, too weary to argue. Night fell early in the storm. Darkness pressed against the windows, and the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and piling snow higher against the door. Eli set out a bedroll for himself near the fire, spreading thick quilts over it. For Pearl Hart, he gestured toward the narrow cot tucked against the far wall, piled high with homespun blankets. She hesitated again, the old instincts flaring. Fear, distrust, the knowledge of how easily kindness could twist into cruelty. But Eli made no move toward her. No demand, no expectation. He simply settled onto his bedroll, tugged a quilt over himself, and closed his eyes. Pearl Hart changed out of her wet dress as best she could behind the scant cover of a hanging blanket, slipping into a flannel nightgown she had packed in her carpetbag. She burrowed into the cot, pulling the blankets up to her chin, the smell of wood smoke and pine filling her lungs. Sleep should have come easily, but her mind churned, replaying the humiliation at the station. The cold finality of Martin Kane's rejection. Tears welled and slipped down her cheeks, silent and hot against the frozen numbness that had claimed her for so long. She wept for her father, for her mother, for the life that had led her to a strange man's cabin on the edge of the world. She wept for the pieces of herself she had lost along the way. And in the quiet between sobs she heard a soft shuffling sound. A quilt landing gently at the foot of her cot. Eli's voice, low and careful in the dark. "Snow's colder than most reckon," he said. "Thought you might could use another." She didn't answer, couldn't trust her voice not to betray her. But she pulled the extra quilt up over herself, burying her face in its rough, comforting warmth. The storm raged outside, battering the cabin, the world beyond reduced to chaos and fury. But inside the fire burned steady. And within her a tiny, stubborn ember flickered to life, refusing to be extinguished. She slept, finally, not because she had given up, but because for the first time in a long while, she believed she might wake to something better. The last thing she saw before dreams claimed her was the silver cross glinting faintly in the firelight, resting just above her heart. And somewhere deep inside she dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, someone saw her worth, not in spite of that cross but because of it. The days blurred into one another, stitched together by the steady rhythm of the storm and the quiet pulse of survival. Morning brought pale gray light and the endless whisper of snow against the cabin walls. Evening folded the world into darkness again, wrapping it in deep, frozen silence. Pearl Hart learned the cabin's language in small, careful steps. How the floorboards creaked just before the stove needed more wood. How the kettle whistled low and tired when the water was ready. How Eli's footsteps, slow and deliberate, carried a different kind of warmth than the fire ever could. They spoke little at first. Not from discomfort but from a shared reverence for the quiet. Words were rationed like sugar or kerosene, used only when necessary, each one carrying weight and meaning. When Eli taught Pearl Hart how to split kindling, he showed her with his own hands first, not just instructions but an invitation. He placed the hatchet in her grip, his large hand steadying hers just long enough for her to feel the right balance, the right tension. Then he stepped back, letting her try, trusting her strength without coddling her weakness. The first log cracked under her swing, splitting cleanly, and Eli offered a nod that felt more valuable than any spoken praise. In return, Pearl Hart mended one of his shirts by lamplight, stitching neat rows along a tear that had frayed from years of work and weather. Her fingers found their rhythm as she sat at the table, the silver needle flashing in the firelight, and for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, she felt useful, needed, capable. One evening, as the storm's fury waned to a soft, constant snowfall, Eli rummaged through a battered box tucked beneath his bed and pulled out a small, worn pouch. Inside he found a delicate pair of pliers and a coil of fine wire. He knelt before Pearl Hart where she sat by the hearth, cradling her cross necklace between his calloused fingers. "Clasps near broken," he said simply. She nodded, unable to find her voice. With a patience that spoke of long practice with small, stubborn things, Eli worked the wire through the broken links, mending the fragile chain. His brows furrowed in concentration, and Pearl Hart watched the way his rough hands moved so carefully, as if the cross were something sacred. When he finished, he looped the necklace gently around her neck again, the metal cool against her skin, the weight familiar and comforting. For a long moment they stayed like that, her sitting, him kneeling, the space between them pulsing with something neither of them dared name. Outside, the snow thickened again, soft as a lullaby. Days later, as the world slowly shifted from blinding white to muted gray, Eli hitched up the horse and sled, preparing for a supply run into town. Pearl Hart bundled herself in every spare layer she could find and insisted on coming along. The journey was slow, the road half buried, but together they carved a path through it, side by side. Eli offered her the reins once they reached flatter ground, guiding her hands as she learned the feel of the horse's gait through leather and wood. It was in town, under the wary gazes of neighbors and strangers alike, that Pearl Hart realized how far she had traveled, not just across miles, but across the barren plains of her own heart. Eli walked beside her as they bartered for flour and coffee, never once stepping ahead of her, never shielding her from the world or thrusting her into it. He stood with her. Not for her. Not despite her. With her. At the general store, a neighbor family bustled in, melting the chill from the air with their noisy warmth. Mrs. Harper, a woman with broad hips and a ready laugh, swept Pearl Hart into a brief but fierce embrace, chattering about barn dances and quilting bees and the upcoming spring fair. It was the life Pearl Hart had once dreamed of: community, connection, belonging. As she watched the Harpers tease each other and share news of neighbors lost and found, she realized that longing still lived within her, stubborn as spring beneath the snow. Eli caught her looking and offered a small, knowing smile. "Good folks," he said. Pearl Hart nodded, her heart aching with the sudden, fierce hope that maybe she could find a place among them. That maybe she was not too strange, too bruised, too burdened to belong. The trip back to the cabin was quieter but not heavy. A kind of contented silence stretched between them, filled with the promise of new beginnings. That night, Pearl Hart stood outside while Eli banked the fire, the vast sweep of sky overhead a deep velvet blue, pricked with distant stars. The snow had finally eased into a gentle drift, soft and constant, wrapping the world in delicate white. She lifted her face to the sky, letting the cold kiss her cheeks, feeling small and infinite all at once. Eli joined her after a moment, his presence a warm, solid weight beside her. They stood there for a long time, saying nothing, breathing in the same frozen air, bound together by something deeper than words. At last Pearl Heart spoke, her voice no more than a breath. "I thought I was coming here to find a life," she said, the truth unwinding from her chest like a thread. "To build something. To start again." Eli said nothing, only waited. "But it feels like—" she faltered, then found her courage. "It feels like I was meant to find myself." Eli reached out, slow and deliberate, and took her hand in his. His palm was rough, lined with work and loss and living, but it closed around hers with a gentleness that stole her breath. "You ain't lost," he said quietly, his words sinking into her bones like the heat of the stove after a long day in the cold. "You're right here." Pearl Heart turned to him, searching his face for doubt or pity or false hope, but found none. Only steady, unwavering truth. He saw her, the battered places, the tender places, the strength she had hidden even from herself. And somehow, impossibly, he honored all of it. The firelight flickered through the window, casting their shadows long across the snow. Pearl Heart squeezed his hand, grounding herself in the solid, living reality of it all. They were two broken things, battered by life and loss and loneliness, standing together beneath the endless, frozen sky. And in that moment, Pearl Heart realized something so simple and profound it stole the cold right out of her bones. Home was not a place. Home was a hand held steady in the dark. Home was trust, offered freely and without expectation. Home was someone who saw your broken pieces and chose to stay. The snow whispered around them, weaving their shadows tighter, binding them not with chains, but with the fragile, unbreakable threads of hope. Pearl Heart leaned into Eli, resting her head against his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heart beneath her cheek. And for the first time in her life, she let herself believe that she was enough. Not because someone had claimed her. Not because she had proven her worth. But simply because she was. The world beyond the cabin was still cold, still brutal, still uncertain. But within that small, hard-won circle of warmth, Pearl Heart and Eli stood together. And together they would weather whatever storms came next. The snow began to melt in slow, stubborn patches, pulling the land from its long white sleep. Ice broke free from the edges of the roof in sharp, sudden cracks, and the muddy paths that had once been roads began to reappear, slick and treacherous but full of promise. Life stirred in the world again, tentative and raw. Inside the cabin, a new rhythm took hold. Pearl Heart rose early, tending the fire and mending clothes, humming soft hymns under her breath. Eli spent hours outside, repairing the fence, chopping wood, whistling tunes no one else seemed to know. There was comfort in the simple, steady work, in the way their lives wove together without need for grand Pearl Heartians. Still, the thaw brought more than just renewal. It carried reminders, too, of what had been lost and what still waited to be faced beyond the safe cocoon they had built. It was Pearl Heart who first suggested the trip into town, her voice steady but her hands betraying a tremble she couldn't quite hide. Supplies were low, true enough, but more than that, there was a part of her that needed to walk back into the world she had once been cast out of. To stand upright where she had once been left to sink into the snow. Eli watched her closely when she spoke, weighing something behind those riverstone eyes. Then he nodded, the barest dip of his chin, and began saddling the horse. The ride was easier than before, the snow giving way to thick, clinging mud. The sky overhead was a patchwork of blue and gray, the sun struggling to break free of winter's lingering grip. They traveled side by side, not speaking much, but sharing glances, small smiles, a language more honest than anything that could be said aloud. When the town came into view, Pearl Heart felt her breath catch. The station where she had first arrived stood like a ghost, the platform still scarred by memories she could not unsee. Faces turned toward them as they rode in, some curious, some indifferent, a few marked with the hard lines of judgment. Pearl Heart straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin, the cross at her throat gleaming in the pale light. She felt Eli's steady gaze settle on her, not pushing, not pulling, just there, unwavering. They dismounted near the general store, tying the horse to a post slick with melting ice. Eli offered his hand, a small, simple gesture, and Pearl Heart took it without hesitation, grounding herself in his touch. Inside the store, the air was thick with the smell of kerosene and leather and sawdust. Mr. Price, the storekeeper, glanced up from his ledger and offered a curt nod. A few other townsfolk lingered near barrels of seed and bolts of calico, their conversation dipping as Pearl Heart passed. She felt their eyes like a weight on her back, felt the way they measured her, not by who she was but by who they thought she had failed to be. And then she saw him. Martin Kane, standing near the shelves of tobacco, his hat tipped low over his brow, his mouth twisted into something that might have once been a smile but had long since soured into something uglier. For a heartbeat, the world tilted. The memory of cold rejection, the sting of humiliation, flared up like an old wound torn open. But Pearl Hart did not look away. Martin saw her then, saw the dress that no longer hung heavy with shame, saw the cross that no longer bowed her shoulders, saw the man who stood quietly at her side. His gaze flicked to Eli, measuring, weighing, dismissing. He stepped forward, the spurs on his boots clinking softly against the wooden floor. "Didn't expect to see you still hanging around," he drawled, voice oily with false charm. Pearl Hart said nothing. She did not need to. Eli shifted slightly, not aggressive, not threatening, just there, a living wall between her and anything that might wish her harm. Martin sneered, emboldened by the watching eyes. He reached out as if to touch Pearl Hart's arm, some old, bitter claim rising to the surface. Eli's hand shot out, catching Martin's wrist in a grip that spoke of mountains moved and rivers redirected. There was no violence in it, only certainty, a simple, immovable truth. Martin flinched, trying to jerk free, but Eli released him calmly, as if handling a child who had yet to understand the world's harder lessons. "You made your choice," Eli said, voice quiet but carrying. "Now let her be." Martin's face darkened, but he stepped back, pride smarting, anger simmering just beneath his skin. He turned and stalked from the store, spitting into the muddy street as he went, his retreat a small, ugly thing compared to the storm Pearl Hart had survived. The room exhaled. Conversation resumed in cautious murmurs. Mr. Price cleared his throat and began stacking tins with unnecessary vigor. Pearl Hart let out a slow, shuddering breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Eli said nothing, only offered his arm again, a silent bridge across the chasm that had tried to open beneath her. They finished their errands with quiet efficiency, gathering flour, coffee, dried beans. When they stepped back into the cold, the sun had finally broken free, washing the muddy streets in a thin, trembling light. As they rode back toward the cabin, Pearl Hart felt the last of something fall away inside her. The lingering shame, the gnawing doubt, the belief that she had been broken beyond mending. The land unfurled before them, vast and open and waiting. Weeks passed. The snow melted into rivers and streams, the earth drinking greedily after its long thirst. Green shoots broke through the dirt, tentative and trembling but alive. Pearl Hart planted a small garden behind the cabin, coaxing beans and squash and wild herbs from the stubborn soil. Eli repaired the barn roof, his shirt damp with sweat, his laughter rare but rich when it came. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon in shades of gold and crimson, Pearl Hart stood by the garden, brushing dirt from her hands. Eli approached, his steps slower than usual, a small wooden box in his hand. She turned to him, curious, heart thudding. He opened the box without ceremony, revealing a simple silver ring, the metal shaped by hand, imperfect and beautiful. He didn't kneel, didn't make speeches. He just held it out to her, eyes steady, voice rough with something deeper than words. "I ain't offering you a grand house," he said. "Ain't offering you riches. Just a place. A life. With me." Pearl Hart felt tears sting her eyes, not from sorrow but from the sheer, blinding tenderness of it. She took the ring with trembling fingers, slipping it onto her hand, feeling it settle like it had been waiting there all along. "I ain't asking for anything else," she said, voice breaking into a smile. Eli reached out, cupping her face in his calloused hands, and kissed her. It was not the desperate, claiming kiss of a man trying to possess something. It was the kiss of a man honoring a covenant older than any church, older than any law. The stars blinked awake overhead, and the earth sighed beneath them, and somewhere deep within the sleeping woods, the first crickets of spring began to sing. They were married in the clearing behind the cabin a week later, under an arch of wildflowers and raw, open sky. No preacher, no papers, just promises spoken with hands and hearts and a faith no storm could shake. Mrs. Harper and her brood came, bringing food and laughter. The station master, his scarf still too long, brought a crooked cake. Even Mr. Price sent a jar of penny candy with a gruff note of congratulations. And when Pearl Hart stood beside Eli, the cross at her throat glinting in the sunlight, she felt whole in a way she had never known was possible. Not because he completed her, but because he saw her, every scar, every sorrow, every stubborn, shining piece, and chose her. Not despite it, but because of it. As night fell and the stars embroidered themselves across the heavens, Pearl Hart stood at the edge of the clearing, feeling the weight of her old life fall away entirely. Eli came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist, resting his forehead against hers. "You're home now," he said, the words a benediction, a truth. She smiled, leaning into him, feeling the solid beat of his heart echo in her own. And she knew, with a certainty deeper than any vow, that whatever storms came, whatever winters tried to steal the light from the land, they would weather it together. For home was not built of wood or stone. It was built of hands held steady through every broken season. It was built of love that asked for nothing but the chance to endure. It was built of two souls finding shelter in each other beneath the endless, forgiving sky. And so, dear traveler, if ever you find yourself lost in a storm, remember this: there is always someone out there waiting, not to change you, not to save you, but to walk beside you. If this story touched a corner of your heart, leave a word below, share your light, and tell us from where in this wide, wild world you are listening. You are part of this journey too. The sun over Rose Creek beat down with a cruel vengeance, bleaching the red dust into something almost holy. The Founders' Day festival was in full swing, ribbons dancing in the wind, fiddle tunes slicing through the air, laughter rising like smoke from a fire. But none of that joy reached Mary Beth Calloway. She stood at the edge of the wooden platform outside the town hall, her breath shallow, arms at her sides, thick hands clenched into trembling fists. The crowd gathered not to celebrate, but to watch the sheriff finish what had started as a whisper and festered into a full-blown execution of pride. Sheriff Cole Madden, tall as a pine and just as unbending, stood before her with a crooked sneer. His silver badge glinted like a dagger in the light. "Mary Beth," he drawled, voice slow as molasses but sharp enough to draw blood. "The town council has voted. You're no longer welcome here." The words came like buckshot. Gasps flitted through the crowd like startled birds. Mary Beth didn't flinch. Not when Cole dropped her mother's brooch into the dust at her feet. Not when old Widow Granger turned away with a shake of her head. Not even when little Billy Tucker, barely 10 years old, laughed and called her a cow. "You gonna say anything?" Cole prodded. She looked at him, slow and deliberate, with eyes the color of burnt sugar and full of storm. "No," she said. She knelt in silence, lifted the brooch from the dirt, wiped it clean on the hem of her dress. Her fingers lingered on it for a moment, her face unreadable. Then she turned, skirt swishing like a banner in retreat, and walked through the crowd that parted with the unease of those watching a funeral procession. She heard them whisper words like lazy, too big, takes up too much. Not one hand reached for her. Not one mouth asked her to stay. Out beyond the town's edge, the sound of merriment faded. Her mule, Pickle, waited by the old fence post, already saddled with the few belongings she owned, clothes, needles, some torn fabric swatches, and a copy of Little Women she'd read cover to cover until the spine cracked. She mounted without grace but with firm resolve. The sun blistered her skin. Dust clung to the sweat on her brow. She didn't cry. Not when the church bell rang in cruel celebration behind her. Not when the bitter wind rose, catching the fabric of her dress like sails against a storm. She was born in Rose Creek, orphaned at 7 when the fire took her parents and half their dry goods store. Raised by Aunt Esther, who believed that a girl could be whatever she wanted, until sickness and sorrow made her whisper otherwise. Beth had survived on grit, calloused hands and thick skin, literally and otherwise. She was 12 when they first called her Big Beth. 14 when the boys started daring each other to dance with her for a joke. 16 when she caught 2 girls laughing behind her in church and heard the words barn-sized, like a slap across the soul. But she'd never begged for acceptance. Not once. She made her own dresses, stitched them from scraps with hands so skilled even the mayor's wife once asked her to sew a hem, though she later claimed she'd done it herself. Beth had a dream once, a small shop tucked between the saloon and the barber, filled with velvet, lace and her own name carved above the door. But dreams in Rose Creek came with caveats. You had to be the right shape, the right sound, the right kind of woman. She wasn't. And now she was gone. The plains opened wide before her, the horizon stretching into possibility and peril. The silence out here was not the cruel kind, it was patient, like the land was watching, waiting to see what she'd do. By sundown, her hands were blistered from the rains, her throat dry as cotton. She made camp by a scraggly patch of mesquite, built a small fire, and sat cross-legged while Pickle gnawed on grass nearby. She held the brooch close, let the metal warm in her palm. It was shaped like a magnolia. Her mother's favorite flower, though it never grew in this dust-choked land. The night deepened. Coyotes howled in the distance. She watched the firelight flicker and thought, not for the first time, about whether there was something truly wrong with her. Not just her size but the core of her, the parts people didn't see and judged anyway. A branch snapped. Beth froze, hand creeping to the small pistol in her satchel. Another snap, closer this time. Her heart pounded in her ears. She didn't shout. Didn't call for help. She rose silently, gun in hand, eyes scanning the darkness. Then she saw it. A rattlesnake coiled beside a rock, eyes gleaming in the firelight. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. One breath. One clean shot. The echo rolled across the flat land like thunder. The snake's body twitched once, then stilled. Beth sat down slowly, breath catching in her throat. From a hilltop beyond her firelight, a figure on horseback watched. A man with a wide-brimmed hat and a face half hidden in shadow. He didn't speak. Didn't move. Just watched. Clayton Briggs had seen a lot of things in his life. Men break, horses die, towns rot from the inside. But he'd never seen a woman face a snake like that without blinking. He said nothing. Just turned his horse and rode back into the night. Beth never knew he'd been there. She poked at the fire until the flames danced higher, a soft light flickering in her tired eyes. "I won't cry for them," she whispered. "Not one damn tear." Then, because there was nothing else to do, she laid down beneath the stars, her head on a saddlebag, the gun close at hand, the brooch pressed tight against her chest. She fell asleep to the sound of the wind whispering across the plains like it was carrying secrets only the wild could know. And the land listened. By the second morning, Mary Beth's legs ached like she'd been trampled by a dozen stampedes. Her hands were raw, eyes sunburnt, and her mule was grumpier than ever. Pickle had no interest in heading anywhere but back toward town. Beth tugged the reins gently, not begging but bargaining. "Ain't no future behind us," she muttered. "You want apples again, we go forward." They crested a low rise and found the fence just before sunrise. Rusted barbed wire stretched in jagged lines, half buried in tumbleweed. Beyond it lay a battered ranch, part ghost town, part stubborn miracle. The main house stood with one side caved in, the barn listing like a drunkard, the corral empty. And still, smoke curled from a chimney. Beth squinted into the low light. Someone lived here. Her knees threatened to buckle, but she stepped forward, Pickle dragging behind. A shot rang out, not close but not far. A warning. She froze. Then raised one hand slowly and called out, her voice rough as gravel. "Ain't here to steal. Ain't here to beg. Just need water." Silence. Then out of the haze a figure emerged. He moved like a man who knew his land, boots silent, steps sure. Tall, sun-leathered, lean. His hat shadowed most of his face, but the jawline was cut from the same stone as the hills behind him. A rifle rested easy in his hand, not aimed but not idle. She didn't lower her hand. "Mary Beth Calloway. Most folks call me Big Beth. You can too if you're feeling cruel or lazy." The corner of his mouth twitched. "Clayton Briggs. That your bullet?" "Just the noise. The bullet's in a stump." "Fair enough." He looked her over like a rancher would a storm cloud, trying to figure if it'd bring rain or ruin. "You're far from town." "They asked me to leave." Loudly. "Thought I'd listen." She saw his eyes flicker. Not pity. Appraisal. "You hurt." "Only in the places I can't stitch." He nodded once. "Got a pump by the barn. You're welcome to water. That mule looks about 5 minutes from Keeling." Beth followed, too proud to limp. By noon, she'd had her fill of well water, rinsed her face, and let Pickle drink until his ears twitched with pleasure. She was ready to move on when Briggs handed her a tin cup filled with coffee and gestured toward a tree stump like it was the finest chair in the house. "You any good with a hammer?" Beth arched a brow. "Better with a needle. Got fences to mend. Chickens to undam. If you're looking for work, I got it. Not charity. Not favors. Pays food and a roof." She took the cup, let the steam sting her lips. "You don't know me," she said. "I know the kind of person who walks the prairie alone and doesn't flinch at a warning shot." She nodded once. "Then I reckon I'll stay." The first week was fire and splinters. Beth pulled wire till her arms felt torn from the socket. She chased chickens with a fury that made Clayton chuckle from the porch. He was a man of few words, but each one landed like a nail in hard oak, solid, thoughtful, precise. She rebuilt the henhouse, stitched new curtains from feed sacks, and turned a half-rotten cart into a storage bin. Her hands bled nightly. Her muscles screamed. But she didn't complain, not once. And when the ranch hands, 3 rough-spoken men who tolerated Clayton's odd ways, made their jokes, Beth gave it right back. On the 4th night, when one of them, a wiry man named Jude, bet she couldn't ride the bull in the outer pen, Beth climbed over the fence barefoot and grinned like sin. 10 seconds, Jude said, spitting tobacco. "Make it 15, Beth fired back. The bull tossed her by 12, but she landed on her feet, dusted off and bowed. Jude paid up without a word. Even Clayton cracked a smile. But it wasn't all laughs. The land was brutal. Coyotes took 2 hens. A spring wagon shattered an axle. Beth stitched up a calf with one hand while holding the lantern with the other. At night, her shoulders burned and her ribs ached, but there was something in her chest that had been missing for years, a low, steady thrum of belonging. One evening, under a sky bruised with dusk, Beth found herself alone in the barn. She stood staring at an old photograph nailed to a support beam. A young boy, maybe 12, holding a baby goat with a lopsided grin. The edges were curled, weathered. Clayton's voice came from the doorway, low and quiet. "That was my brother. Died before his voice even cracked." Beth didn't turn. "I had a brother too. Lasted 5 days. Buried him in a shoebox." She looked at her hands. "I've stitched so many things, clothes, curtains, even saddle straps. Never fixed a person though. Not really." Clayton stepped beside her. "Some people don't break clean. Can't just patch them up." She nodded. "Sometimes I think I wasn't made to be loved. Not in the way others are." Silence swelled between them, heavy but not cruel. The next morning she found a new wooden workbench set up beside the barn. Tools she hadn't seen before, needles, fabrics, a spool of fine thread. No note, no speech. Just a gift. She ran her fingers along the smooth wood, eyes stinging. She didn't say thank you. Didn't have to. Trouble came 3 days later, riding on a crooked horse and carrying a shotgun like a second limb. Jed Crane, mouthful of rot and venom, led 3 men up the trail toward Dead Horse Hollow like they were coming for a funeral. Clayton was out by the fields. Beth stood on the porch, shotgun propped at her hip. She didn't blink when Crane tipped his hat. "Afternoon," he said with the oily smile of a man who'd never earned a straight day's work. "Didn't know you'd hired new help." Beth didn't return the smile. "New help can shoot too." Crane's eyes slid over her frame, not with desire but disdain. "Gutsy for a," he paused, cocking his head. "For a woman your density." Beth didn't flinch. She just shifted the shotgun slightly. "You want to finish that sentence, or do you want to keep all your teeth?" Jude and the others appeared behind her, quiet but ready. Crane's smirk faltered. "Tell your boss I'll be back. The land's not his to keep. Railroad's buying. And they don't care about squatters or sad cows." "Tell him yourself," Beth said. "And bring flowers for your grave." Crane spat near her boots and rode off, but not fast. He wasn't done. Later, Clayton sat at the table, hands clasped like he was praying to the wood grain. "They want the land for track lines. He's right about the railroad. But wrong if he thinks I'll run." Beth set down a plate of stew. "We don't run." He looked at her, and for the first time, something in his gaze cracked. "You don't owe me this fight." She pulled a chair out, sat down. "Maybe not. But I've never had land worth bleeding for. Never had a name worth keeping. Now I've got both." He said nothing. But he smiled just enough. That night the wind kicked up hard. Beth couldn't sleep. She walked the ranch, checked the fence lines, counted chickens, whispered to Pickle. She paused at the edge of the property, looked out toward Rose Creek, far beyond the hills. She thought of the people who'd cast her out, how small their world seemed now. Inside her, something shifted. Not anger. Not revenge. Just a quiet resolve. No one was going to take this from her. Not again. Back in the barn, she stitched a new banner for the fence gate. A small thing, scrap fabric sewn tight. 2 words, bold and steady. Ironheart Ranch. She stood in the doorway as dawn rose, her silhouette framed by amber light. The land had tested her. She wasn't done yet. The fire started at the edge of the eastern pasture, where the wind slid through the dry grass like a whispered curse. Beth smelled it before she saw it, an acrid coil of smoke that didn't belong in the late spring air. She dropped the feed sack where she stood and sprinted toward the ridge. The flames leapt like dancers drunk on madness, orange teeth devouring fence posts, paint-chipped rails, and wild scrub. Behind her, the barn bell clanged, Jude ringing the alarm. Chickens scattered, horses neighed in panic, and the earth itself seemed to tremble under the weight of it. Backsides lit too. Boone yelled, his voice hoarse as he galloped by on horseback, hat snatched by the wind. "We're boxed in." Beth didn't freeze. She moved like the fire was chasing her shadow. She kicked open the water barrels, grabbed a shovel, and started slapping down embers before they kissed the barn walls. Her sleeves scorched. Her boots smoked. She didn't stop. Not when her hands blistered. Not when her lungs begged. She caught sight of Clayton hauling water by the troughs, soaked to the chest, face blackened with soot. He saw her too and nodded once. No words. Just grit. Crane? She shouted over the roar. He didn't answer, but his eyes said enough. This wasn't nature. This was a warning. Beth grit her teeth so hard her jaw ached. They wanted her to run. To leave the land charred and broken and head back to where the small-minded whispered her name like a curse. But this ranch had her blood in the dirt now, and blood made things sacred. Hours later, the fire died down with the stars rising like pale spectators overhead. They stood in the ash-streaked silence, the survivors of yet another test. Only half the fence remained. The shed was gone. One mare had bolted and not come back. Beth sat on an overturned bucket, coughing smoke, fingers raw and blackened. "They'll come again," Jude said quietly, crouching beside her. Beth looked toward the hills. "Let them. They'll find something waiting." Clayton approached with a flask of creek water. He handed it to her without speaking. She drank deeply, then wiped her mouth with her sleeve. "I'm not just staying," she rasped. "I'm fighting." He crouched next to her, leaned in close so only she could hear. "I should have stopped them. Years ago. Crane's been circling like a buzzard since my father passed. You've got the land," she said. "And now they know it has fire in its bones." He looked at her hands, swollen and blackened. "You need to rest." "I'll rest when this place has roots deep enough they can't burn through." That night, sleep didn't come easy. Beth sat in the dark, lantern low, sewing stitches into torn saddlebags more for the motion than the need. Her fingers moved from muscle memory, but her mind flicked back to the first time she saw fire. That night the store burned, her parents inside. No one remembered it. No one but her. Clayton's footsteps crunched the gravel softly. "You always mend things at midnight?" he asked. "Only what matters." He leaned against the post. "They'll come with more than fire next time. Guns. Lawyers. Men paid not to feel." She nodded. "Let them come. I'm done folding." "You remind me of my mother," he said after a beat. Beth didn't respond. She wasn't sure if it was meant as a compliment. "She didn't talk much either," he added with a half-smile. Beth raised an eyebrow. "Funny. You've got jokes after a fire?" "Only the good ones survive it," he said. She chuckled, just a breath of it, but it felt real. They worked side by side for the next 3 days, rebuilding what they could. Boone reinforced the barn's roof. Jude scavenged wood from abandoned fence lines. Beth patched gear and cooked meals hearty enough to make grown men cry. Her body ached like she'd swallowed rocks, but she moved with purpose. On the 4th morning, a letter arrived. No name, just "to the woman who thinks this land makes her brave." Inside, one line hand-scrawled in coal-black ink. "Next time we won't warn you." Beth stared at the words for a long time before she handed the note to Clayton. His jaw set hard. "They're scared." "Good," she said. Fear is a fine thing to serve cold. But something in her chest twisted. Not fear, something older. Something like the echo of rejection, the shadow of every door that had ever slammed in her face. Later that evening she sat on the porch steps, elbows on her knees, watching the moon claw its way above the pines. The land smelled of ash and sweat and possibility. Clayton joined her quietly, sitting just close enough their shoulders nearly touched. "Why did you come out here?" he asked. "Because there was nothing left back there." He waited, not pushing. "I got tired of being too much for them. Too loud. Too wide. Too stubborn. I thought maybe the prairie wouldn't mind." "It doesn't," he said. Beth looked over at him, really looked. "No," she said. "It doesn't." The quiet stretched between them, long and kind. He shifted, then asked, "You ever think about going back? Proving them wrong?" She shook her head. "That would mean I care what they think. I don't want to change their minds. I want to make sure they never get to change mine again." The next day she found a paintbrush and the leftover whitewash and walked to the front gate. The wind tugged at her dress, cool and certain. She repainted the sign, Ironheart Ranch, bolder, clearer. By afternoon, a rider came fast from Rose Creek, dust flying in thick clouds. A boy, barely 16, mouth dry and eyes wide. "Miss Calloway?" he asked. Beth stood square. "That's me. Mayor's calling a land claim. Says Dead Horse Hollow is under review for seizure." She felt the words like a weight, but she didn't flinch. "Then I guess I better dress for town." Clayton stepped up beside her, arms folded. "You don't have to go alone." "I do," she said. "They threw me out like trash. I'm gonna walk back in like thunder." She turned to the boy. "Tell the mayor I'm coming. And this time I've got more than just boots on my feet. I've got a name." She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. The land would keep her breath, her sweat, her fire. As she saddled Pickle, her eyes burned with something sharper than fear. Purpose, rage, pride, all wound into something solid. When she rode toward town, her back was straight, her hair braided tight, her mother's brooch pinned high on her chest like a badge of memory. No more fires from the shadows. Next time she'd bring her own. Beth rode into Rose Creek like a dust storm on legs, her duster coat billowing behind her, boots echoing against the boards of a town that had once spat her out like a bad taste. She didn't hide her face, didn't dip her head. Her eyes were hard flint, shoulders squared, her revolver resting at her hip, not for show, not for threat, but as truth. She didn't come to beg. She came to end things. The streets had gone quiet before she even reached the saloon. Eyes peeked through half-drawn curtains. Conversations dried up like water in July. Men who once laughed at her behind whiskey glasses now stepped back like they feared the weight of her shadow. Sheriff Cole Madden was waiting on the porch of the mayor's office, the brim of his hat pulled low, a fresh cigar smoldering between his teeth. He didn't greet her. He looked at her like she was something ancient that had clawed its way out of the ground. "Well," he said, voice flat. Hell done froze over. Beth stopped at the steps. "Guess you'll need warmer boots." She didn't wait for permission. She walked straight past him, shouldering open the doors to the town hall. Inside, the council was gathered, 5 men in waistcoats, their bellies full and their eyes narrow. At the head of the table sat Mayor Aldous Pritchard, skin thin as parchment and smile thinner still. He didn't rise. "Miss Calloway," he said, pretending at courtesy. "Didn't expect you back." "I never left," she replied. "I just found better ground." "We've heard rumors," Pritchard said, folding his hands, "that you've taken up illegal occupation of the Hollow, that you've been resisting rightful land development, that you've threatened." Beth slapped the deed down on the table like it was a gauntlet. Signed by Clayton Briggs' father. Stamped by the territorial office. Legal and binding. "This land doesn't belong to the railroad, and it sure as hell doesn't belong to you." Pritchard blinked. "That land was left unattended. According to code. It was abandoned, not unclaimed," she snapped. "We built it back. With our hands. With our blood. You want to call it empty, then I suggest you come dig us up first." A slow hush filled the chamber. Even the sheriff looked away. Pritchard leaned back, his voice icy. "You're making enemies." Beth leaned forward, voice low, eyes steady. "I've had enemies my whole life. You think one more scares me?" A door creaked open at the back. Jed Crane stepped in, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. His coat was dusted in trail dirt, his boots still wet from morning dew, but the pistol on his belt was freshly cleaned. "Well, well," he drawled, tipping an imaginary hat. "The Queen of Cowland herself." Beth didn't look at him. "Come to add arson to your resume?" He smiled, all teeth. "You've got no proof of that." "I've got enough scars to testify." Crane moved closer, his hand inching toward his belt. "Maybe you should have stayed in the dirt where we put you." Beth's hand hovered just near her revolver, fingers relaxed. Clayton's voice cracked through the room like a thunderclap. "Step away from her, Jed." He stood at the entrance, dust in his hair, coat open, boots muddy. "No show. Just steel." Crane laughed. "This your girl now, Briggs?" "She's her own," Clayton said. "But if you lay a finger on her, I'll make sure you never hold a gun again." "Big words," Crane muttered. "Backed by a big rifle," Clayton replied, stepping forward. Sheriff Madden finally moved, hand raised. "Enough. We're not spilling blood on council floors. Pritchard, call this." The mayor stood, face pale. "You want to fight this in the courts, you can. But this meeting is over." Beth didn't move. "You've taken everything from people like me. Dignity. Safety. Hope. You pushed me out like I was the plague. And I still didn't break." Her voice rose now, filling the room like thunder. "You call me too much. Too loud. Too strong. But this world was built by people like me. The ones you underestimate. The ones who survive anyway." She stepped back, eyes sweeping over the council like a judge at reckoning. "We're not asking anymore. We're claiming." Then she turned and walked out, the silence behind her deeper than any gunshot. Outside, the sun had dropped behind the church steeple, casting long shadows across the square. People were gathering, quiet, hesitant, curious. Word had spread. Rose Creek loved gossip more than grain, and this was a tale they couldn't help but watch unfold. Beth faced them without apology. "I'm not coming back to stay," she said loud enough for all to hear. "I didn't come to ask forgiveness. I came to remind you that I never needed it." A hush. Then a voice from the crowd. Beth. It was Lena Wright. Her voice trembled like her hands, but she stepped forward. I was wrong, she said. We all were. Beth didn't blink. You laughed while they shoved me out. I was scared of being next, Lena whispered. Beth nodded once. I know. She didn't offer comfort, just truth. But I didn't break, she added. And I'm not small enough to need your approval anymore. Lena stepped back. Others said nothing. But something in the way they looked at her had changed. Not love. Not redemption. Respect. Clayton fell into step beside her as they walked toward their horses. You sure you're done here? He asked. Beth paused, then looked back at the town that had once choked her. I buried the last of it, she said. They rode out slow, wind brushing their faces, the sky bleeding fire and gold. The plains opened to them like a promise. Ironheart Ranch waited with fences still broken, roofs still patched, chickens still half-wild. But it was theirs. Beth stood on the porch that night, watching the stars take their place. Clayton joined her, holding out a cup of coffee. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. They didn't need to. The land breathed beneath their feet. The fire was out, but the heat remained. Not the kind that destroyed, but the kind that forged. And deep in her chest, Beth knew this truth. She hadn't been cast out. She'd been set free. The world hadn't wanted her in its shape, so she made a new one. Ironheart wasn't just a name. It was who she had become.